According to the Encyclopedia Galactica, Neo-Trantor, the small planet of Delicass, renamed Neo-Trantor after the Great Sack, was, for nearly a century, the seat of the last dynasty of the First Empire. It was a shadow world and a shadow empire, and its existence is only of legalistic importance. Under the first of the Neo-Trantorian dynasty, Neo-Trantor was an obscure village of a planet drowned in the shadow of mighty Trantor, until a heart-throttled royal family racing before the fire and flame of the Great Sack, where billions died, sped to it as its last refuge and held out there barely until the roaring wave of rebellion subsided. There the royal family ruled in ghostly splendor over a cadaverous remnant of Imperium. Dagobert IX was Emperor of the Galaxy, Lord of the Universe, and had been 25 on the bloody day he arrived with his father upon Neo-Trantor. His eyes and mind were still alive with the glory and the power of the empire that was. But his son, who might one day be Dagobert X, was born on Neo-Trantor. Beta had definite ideas of what an emperor ought to look like. He ought not to look like somebody's benevolent grandfather. He ought not to be thin and white and faded, or serving cups of tea with his own hand in an expressed anxiety for the comfort of his 3 visitors. But so it was. Dagobert IX chuckled as he poured tea into her stiffly outheld cup. "It is a great pleasure for me, my dear," he said. "I have not had the opportunity of welcoming visitors from my outer provinces for a time now. My son takes care of these details now that I'm older. You haven't met my son? Fine boy. Headstrong, perhaps?" Toran attempted an interruption. "Your Imperial Majesty—" "Yes?" "Your Imperial Majesty, it has not been our intention to intrude upon you, but we have been told that it will require your permission for us to visit the Imperial University Library on Trantor." "Trantor?" questioned the Emperor mildly. "Trantor." Then a look of puzzled pain crossed his thin face. "Trantor," he whispered. "I remember now. I am making plans now to return there with a flood of ships at my back. You shall come with me. Together we will destroy the rebel Gilmer. Together we shall restore the Empire." Magnifico whispered to Beta, "Is this really an emperor? For somehow I thought emperors were greater and wiser than ordinary men." Beta motioned him to be quiet. She said, "If your Imperial Majesty would but sign an order permitting us to go to Trantor, it would greatly avail the common cause." "To Trantor?" The Emperor was blank and uncomprehending. "Sire, the Viceroy of Anacreon, in whose name we speak, sends word that the usurper Gilmer is yet alive," Toran interjected. "Alive? Alive?" thundered Dagobert. "Where? It will be war." "His whereabouts are uncertain. The Viceroy sends us to acquaint you of the fact, but it is only on Trantor that we may find his hiding place. Once discovered—" Yes, he must be found." He was scribbling on a blank sheet, and ended with a flourished D. Beta took the paper from his loose fingers. "Your Imperial Majesty is beloved by the people." Toran rose and bowed low. "Your Imperial Majesty has been kind to us, but the time allotted us for an audience is over." For a moment, Dagobert IX looked like an emperor indeed as he rose and stood stiff-backed while, one by one, his visitors retreated backward through the door, to where 20 armed men intervened and locked the circle about them, a hand weapon flashed. To Beta, consciousness returned sluggishly, but without the "where am I" sensation. She remembered clearly the odd old man who called himself Emperor, and the other men who waited outside. She kept her eyes closed, and listened with painful attention to the voices. There were 2 of them. One was slow and cautious, with a slyness beneath the surface obsequity. The other was hoarse and thick, almost sodden, and blurted out in vicious spurts. Beta liked neither. They laughed together, and Beta's blood was an icy trickle. Torin's voice broke upon her in a slow, hard current of cursing. She opened her eyes, and Torin's, which were upon her, showed open relief. He said fiercely, "This banditry will be answered by the Emperor. Release us." It dawned upon Beta that her wrists and ankles were fastened to the wall and floor by a tight attraction field. Thick Voice sneered with heavy amusement. She saw that he was paunchy, his lower eyelids puffed darkly, and his hair was thinning out. "The Emperor? The poor, mad Emperor?" "I have his pass," Torin claimed. "No subject may hinder our freedom." "But I am no subject, space garbage. I am the regent and crown prince and am to be addressed as such." And then he walked over to Beta, and she looked up at him contemptuously. He said, "Her eyes suit well, Commandant. She is even prettier with them open. I think she'll do. It will be an exotic dish for a jaded taste, eh?" There was a futile surge upward on Torin's part, which the Crown Prince ignored, and Beta felt the iciness travel outward to her skin. Ebling Miz was still unconscious, head lolling weakly upon his chest, but with a sensation of surprise, Beta noted that Magnifico's eyes were open, sharply open, as though awake for many minutes. He whimpered and nodded with his head toward the Crown Prince. "Give me back my Visi-Sonar." The Crown Prince turned sharply toward the new voice. "This is yours, monster?" He swung the instrument from his shoulder where it hung, suspended by its green strap. He fingered it clumsily, trying to sound a chord, and got nothing for his pains. "Can you play it, monster?" Magnifico nodded once. The clown's binding field was broken, and he was nudged ungently to his feet. The Visi-Sonar was thrust into his hand. "Play for us, monster," said the prince. "Play us a serenade of love and beauty for our foreign lady here." At the prince's gesture, Comazon dimmed the lights, and in the dimness, the prince crossed his arms and waited. Magnifico drew his fingers in rapid, rhythmic jumps from end to end of the multi-keyed instrument, and a sharp, gliding rainbow of light jumped across the room. The darkness seemed to intensify and grow thick. Music reached Beta through the muffled folds of invisible blankets. It moved fuzzily, in confused color, and the music was suddenly brassy, evil, flourishing in high crescendo. Something writhed within the light, something with poisonous, metallic scales writhed and yawned, and the music writhed and yawned with it. The music died. It must have lasted 15 minutes, and at its absence, a vast pleasure flooded Beta. Light glared, and Magnifico's face was close to hers, sweaty, wild-eyed, lugubrious. "My lady," he gasped, "how fare you?" "Well enough," she whispered. "But why did you play like that?" She became aware of the others in the room. Torin and Miz were limp and helpless against the wall, but her eyes skimmed over them. There was the prince, lying strangely still at the foot of the table. There was Comazon, moaning wildly through an open, drooling mouth. Comazon flinched and yelled mindlessly as Magnifico took a step toward him. Magnifico turned, and with a leap, turned the others loose. Torin lunged upwards, and with eager, taunt fists, seized Comazon by the neck. "You come with us. We'll want you to make sure we get to our ship." 2 hours later, in the ship's kitchen, Magnifico celebrated the return to space by attacking his dinner with a magnificent disregard of table manners. "Magnifico," asked Beta. "Yes, my lady?" "What was it you played back there?" The clown writhed. "I better not say. I learned it once, and the physiosonar has an effect upon the nervous system most profound. Surely it was an evil thing, and not for your sweet innocence, my lady. Oh, come now, Magnifico. I'm not as innocent as that. I killed him, my lady. What? She swallowed painfully. My lady, this prince looked upon you wickedly, and he choked in a mixture of indignation and embarrassment. Beta felt strange thoughts come and repressed them sternly. Magnifico, you've got a gallant soul. The metal-covered world of Trantor had been, one colossal city, and only the old imperial palace could be identified readily from outer space by a stranger. It was unmistakable when it appeared. The gap in the metal coat of the planet contained hundreds of square miles, enclosing the mighty grace of the ancient imperial residences, surrounded by the planet's only greenery. The Beta hovered and slowly oriented itself. There were only the huge super-causeways to guide them into the bowels of the metal city. It was only as they submerged into the welter of metal that the smooth beauty apparent from the air dissolved into the broken, twisted, near wreckage that had been left in the wake of the sack. What the map indicated to be the university area was reached by dead reckoning. Upon the flat area of what once must have been a busy landing field, the ship lowered itself. The thin life of Trantor trickled to nothing when they entered among the wide-spaced buildings of the university. A solemn and lonely silence reigned. The library was a deceptively small building which broadened out vastly underground into a mammoth volume of silence and reverie. Ebbling Miz paused before the elaborate murals of the reception room. He whispered, one had to whisper here, I think we passed the catalogue rooms a way back. I'll stop there. His forehead was flushed, his hand trembling. I mustn't be disturbed, Torin. Will you bring my meals down to me? Do you think you'll find anything about the second foundation? Beta's voice was agitated, and Ebbling Miz replied with a soft certainty, I know I will. Torin and Beta came closer to setting up housekeeping in normal fashion than at any time in their year of married life. Ebbling himself was completely buried. He had insisted upon a hammock being slung up for him in the psychology reference room. There were times when the recognition of either Torin or Beta seemed a struggle. He was more himself with Magnifico, who brought him his meals and often sat watching him for hours at a time, with a queer, fascinated absorption, as the aging psychologist transcribed endless equations, cross-referred to endless book films, scurried endlessly about in a wild mental effort toward an end he alone saw. Then, one afternoon, Magnifico's voice was an agitated cry outside. My lady! What is it? Come! Beta's voice choked off sharply when the opening door framed the large, hard-faced Captain Pritchard, cried Torin. Han Pritchard stepped inside. His voice was clear and level, and utterly dead of feeling. My rank is colonel now, under the Mule. Under the Mule? Torin's voice trailed off. Magnifico stared wildly and shrank back behind Torin. Nobody stopped to notice him. Torin's face was a twisted suppression of fury. How did you find us? I followed you to Neo-Trantor. The Mule already had his contacts there. I come in friendliness, believe me. I come of my own will to persuade you of the uselessness of what you are doing. If I fail, I shall leave. That is all. That is all? Well, then peddle your propaganda. Give us your speech and leave. The Mule is a mutant. He cannot be beaten by the very nature of the mutation. Your knowledge won't hurt him. You see, He is capable of adjusting the emotional balance of human beings. It is quite unbeatable. I mean that it is an easy matter for him to instill into a capable general, say, the emotion of utter loyalty to the mule and complete belief in the mule's victory. His most capable enemies become his most faithful subordinates. And you, added Beta bitterly, betray your cause and become Mule's envoy to Trantor. I see. I haven't finished. The Mule's gift works in reverse even more effectively. Despair is an emotion. At the crucial moment, key men on the Foundation, key men on Haven, despaired. Do you mean to say, demanded Beta tensely, that the feeling I had in the time vault was the Mule juggling my emotional control? Mine too. Everyone. Remember how it was on Haven towards the end? Beta turned away. Colonel Pritchard continued earnestly. As it works for worlds, so it works for individuals. Can you fight a force which can make you surrender willingly when it so desires? Beta whirled on him. Your own emotions have been tampered with. You've got faith and belief in the Mule, an unnatural, a diseased faith in the Mule. Of what value are your opinions? You've lost all power of objective thought. You are wrong. Slowly the colonel shook his head. Only my emotions are fixed. My reason is as it always was. And there are some things I can see more clearly now that I am freed of my earlier emotional trend. I can see that the Mule's program is an intelligent and worthy one. He has established a new empire, the colonel continued. In just a brief period of time, in other words, he will have accomplished what all Seldon's psychohistory could not have done in 100 years. The galaxy will have peace and order at last. Pritchard strolled to the door, turned, and said, One last thing. It is known that you search for the second Foundation. The Mule in his time will take his measures. Nothing will help you. Goodbye. He saluted sharply and was gone. Beta turned to a silent Torin and whispered, They even know about the second Foundation. Torin, let's tell Ebling. Maybe he can help. In the recesses of the library, Ebling Niz, unaware of all, crouched under the one spark of light amid the murky spaces and mumbled triumphantly to himself. Ebling Niz raised his head from the long desk and bleared at them as they approached. His thinning hair was scuffed up. His lips made sleepy, smacking noises. He said. Someone want me? Beta sat down and took one of the psychologist's flaccid hands in hers. Beta said, Captain Pritchard has been here. He's discovered the Mule's mutation. But that is nothing new, Miz said. The Mule's mutation is straightened out. In honest astonishment, have I forgotten to tell you? Forgotten to tell us what? Put in Torin quickly. About the Mule's mutation, of course. It tampers with emotions, emotional control. I haven't told you. It requires no specialized knowledge, he said more quietly. You want that second Foundation, don't you? What about the second Foundation, Ebling? Torin said intently. The psychologist clutched at Torin's sleeve. The Foundations were established at a great psychological convention presided over by Hari Seldon. Torin, I have located the published minutes of that convention. 25 films. I have already looked through various summaries. Well, Torin asked, do you know that it is very easy to find out from them the exact location of the first Foundation if you know anything at all about psychohistory? But, Torin, the summaries don't mention the second Foundation. Torin's eyebrows pulled into a frown. It doesn't exist? Of course it exists, cried Miz. Who said it didn't? But there's less talk of it. Its significance and all about it are better hidden, better obscured. Don't you see? the two. It's the critical one, the one that counts. I've got the minutes of the Seldon Convention. The Mule hasn't won yet." The frail psychologist fell asleep in mid-sentence. Without speaking, Torn and Beta made their way up to their own quarters. 1 week later, Beta visited Ebling Miz a second time. Miz was bent over the eyepieces of a projector, motionless, a questing body. Near him sat Magnifico. Beta said softly, "Magnifico." "My lady?" "Torn is back at our ship. Would you bring him this message for me?" "Gladly, my lady. My small services are eagerly yours." She was alone with Ebling Miz. Firmly she placed her hand upon his shoulder. "Ebling." The psychologist started. "What is it? Where's Magnifico?" "I want to talk to you, Ebling, alone." The psychologist made a move to return to his projector, but she held his shoulder firmly. His flesh seemed to have melted away since their arrival on Trantor. "Ebling, what progress have you made on the second foundation?" The psychologist peered up at her. His voice was a whisper, thin and sibilant. "Do you know the thoroughness with which Seldon covered his traces? The papers put out by the convention are often apparently unrelated, always obscure. Sometimes I think he used the convention only as a gigantic front and single-handedly erected the structure." "Of the foundations," urged Beta.
"Of the second foundation. Our foundation was simple. Foundation number 1 was a world of physical scientists. No psychologists were included. It was a peculiar distortion, and must have had a purpose. The usual explanation was that Seldon's psychohistory worked best where human beings had no knowledge of what was coming, and could therefore react naturally to all situations. Do you follow me, my dear?"
"Yes, Doctor."
"Listen carefully. Foundation number 2 was a world of mental scientists. It was the mirror image of our world. Psychology, not physics, was king. You see?"
"I don't."
"But think, Beta. Use your head. Hari Seldon knew that his psychohistory could predict only probabilities, not certainties. There was always a margin of error, and as time passed, that margin increases in geometric progression. Seldon would naturally guard against it as well as he could. Our foundation was scientifically vigorous. It could conquer armies and weapons. It could pit force against force. But what of the mental attack of a mutant such as the Mule?"
"That would be for the psychologists of the second foundation." Beta felt excitement rising within her.
"The stars know at what stage their strength is now. Are they strong enough to fight the Mule? Are they aware of the danger in the first place? Have they capable leaders? And if the second foundation should not beat the Mule, it is bad. Ultimately bad. It is the end, perhaps, of the human race as we know it."
"No," Beta gasped.
"Yes. If the Mule's descendants inherit his mental powers, Homo sapiens could not compete. There would be a new dominant race, a new aristocracy, with Homo sapiens demoted to slave labor as an inferior race."
"Yes, that is so," Beta said.
"And even if by some chance the Mule did not establish a dynasty, he would still establish a distorted new empire upheld by his personal power only. It would die with his death. The galaxy would be left where it was before he came, except that there would no longer be foundations around which a real and healthy second empire could coalesce. It would mean thousands of years of barbarism. It would mean no end in sight."
"What can we do? Can we warn the second foundation?" Beta asked.
"We must, or they may go under through ignorance, which we cannot risk. but there is no way of warning them. I don't know where they're located. They are at the other end of the galaxy, but that is all. And there are millions of worlds to choose from. But, Ebling, don't they say? She pointed vaguely at the films that covered the table. No, they don't. Not where I can find it yet. The secrecy must mean something. There must be a reason. A puzzled expression returned to his eyes. I wish you'd leave. I have wasted enough time, and it's growing short. It's growing short. He turned away, petulant and frowning. Ebling Miz had 7 days to live, and the 7 days slipped by, one after the other, quietly. Miz was a hidden entity whose burrowing work produced nothing and did not make itself known. He had barricaded himself. Neither Torin nor Beta were allowed in to see him. Only his go-between, Magnifico, was evidence of his existence. Magnifico, grown silent and thoughtful, with his tiptoed trays of food, his still, watchful witness in the gloom. Beta, too, was more and more a creature of herself. Her vivacity died, and her self-assured competence wavered. On the last day, Magnifico scampered breathless into their presence. He clutched at them, frightened. "The learned doctor calls for you. He is not well." And he wasn't well. He was in bed, his eyes unnaturally large, unnaturally bright. "Ebling," cried Beta. "Let me speak," croaked the psychologist, lifting his weight to a thin elbow with an effort. "Let me speak. I am finished. The work I pass on to you. I have kept no notes. No other must know. All must remain in your minds." The clown sat down quickly. Beta gazed at the floor. Miz said in a hoarse whisper, "I am convinced the second foundation can win if it is not caught prematurely by the Mule. It has kept itself secret. The secrecy must be upheld. It has a purpose. You must go there. Your information is vital, may make all the difference. Do you hear me?" Torin cried in near agony. "Yes, yes, tell us how to get there, Ebling. Where is it?" "I can tell you," said the faint voice. He never did. Beta, face frozen white, lifted her blaster and shot with an echoing clap of noise. From the waist upward, Miz was not, and a ragged hole was in the wall behind. From numb fingers, Beta's blaster dropped to the floor. The echoes of the blast rolled away into the outer rooms and rumbled downward into a hoarse, dying whisper. There was a silence of agony. Finally, from between teeth still tight, Torin choked out in an unrecognizable voice, "You belong to the Mule, then. He got to you." Beta's head was bent into obscurity. "I belong to the Mule. That's ironic. It's over, Torin. I can talk now. How long I will survive, I don't know, but I can start talking." Torin's tension had broken of its own weight and faded into a flaccid dullness. Talk about what, eh? What's there to talk about? About the calamity that's followed us. Defeat has always bitten at our heels and never actually managed to nip us. We were on the Foundation, and it collapsed while the independent traders still fought, but we got out in time to go to Haven. We were on Haven, and it collapsed while the others still fought. And again, we got out in time. We went on to Neo-Trantor, and by now it's undoubtedly joined the Mule. Torin listened and shook his head. "I don't understand." "Torin, such things don't happen in real life. You and I are insignificant people. We don't fall from one vortex of politics into the other, unless we carry the vortex with us, unless we carry Mrs. Source of infection with us. Now do you see? Torrin's lips tightened, his glance fixed horribly upon Miz's bloody remnants. "Let's get out of here, Bay." It was cloudy outside. Magnifico crept after them, and now he hovered at the edge of their conversation. Torrin said tightly, "You killed Ebling Miz because he was the mule?" He did not believe the implications of his own words. Beta laughed sharply. "Poor Ebling the mule! I couldn't have killed him if he were the mule. He would have detected my emotion as I moved to kill him, and changed it to love, devotion, adoration, terror, whatever he pleased. I killed Ebling because he knew where the second foundation was, and in 2 seconds would have told the mule the secret." "Would have told the mule the secret?" Torrin repeated stupidly. Then he emitted a sharp cry, and turned to stare in horror at the clown. "Not Magnifico?" Torrin whispered the question. "Listen," said Beta. "Do you remember what happened on Neotrantor?" "Oh, think for yourself, Torrin." But he shook his head. She went on wearily. "A man died on Neotrantor. A man died with no one touching him. Magnifico played on his visisonar, and when he was finished, the crown prince was dead. Now, isn't it queer that a creature afraid of everything, apparently helpless with terror, has the capacity to kill at will? I caught the little that visisonar selection that killed the crown prince, just a little, but it was enough to give me that same feeling of despair I had in the time vault and on Haven." Torrin's face was darkening. "I felt it too. I forgot. I never thought. It was then that it first occurred to me. It was just a vague feeling, intuition, if you like. I had nothing to go on. But then Pritchard told us of the mule and his mutation, and it was clear in a moment. It was the mule who had created the despair in the time vault. It was Magnifico who had created the despair on Neotrantor. It was the same emotion. Therefore the mule and Magnifico were the same person. The discovery scared me to death. If Magnifico were the mule, he could know my emotions and manipulate them for his own purposes. I dared not let him know. I avoided him. Luckily, he avoided me also. He was too interested in Ebling Miz. I planned killing Miz before he could talk. I planned it secretly as I could. So secretly I didn't dare tell it to myself. If I could have killed the mule himself, but I couldn't take the chance. He would have noticed, and I would have lost everything." She seemed drained of emotion. Torrin said harshly and with finality, "It's impossible. Look at the miserable creature. He, the mule, he doesn't even hear what we're saying." But when Torrin's eyes followed his pointing finger, Magnifico was erect and alert, his eyes sharp and darkly bright. His voice was without a trace of an accent. "I hear her, my friend. It is merely that I've been brooding on the fact that with all my cleverness and forethought, I could make a mistake and lose so much." Torrin stumbled backwards as if afraid the clown might touch him, or that his breath might contaminate him. Magnifico nodded and answered the unspoken question. His fear was gone. His bearing was firm. "I am the mule," he said tolerantly. "Seat yourselves. I'd like to tell you a story. It's a weakness of mine. I want people to understand me." And his eyes, as he looked at Beta, were still the old, soft, sad, brown ones of Magnifico, the clown. "There is really nothing to my childhood," he began, plunging bodily into quick, impatient speech, "that I care to remember. My mother died before she saw me. I do not know my father. I grew up haphazardly, wounded and tortured in mind, full of self-pity and hatred of others. I was known then as a queer child. All avoided me, most out of dislike, some out of fear. Enough happened to enable Captain Pritchard, in his investigation of the mule's childhood, to realize that I was a mutant, which was more than I ever realized till I was in my 20s.
The whole notion of my unusual powers broke on me slowly, in sluggish steps. Slowly I learned that I could reach into people's minds. But the consciousness of power came, and with it the desire to make up for the miserable position of my earlier life. Maybe you can understand it. Maybe you can try to understand it. It isn't easy to be a freak, to have a mind and an understanding and be a freak. Laughter and cruelty, to be different, to be an outsider. You've never been through it. Magnifico looked up to the sky and reminisced stonily. I decided that the galaxy and I could take turns. Come, they had had their innings, and I had been patient about it for 22 years. My turn. It would be up to the rest of you to take it, and the odds would be fair enough for the galaxy. One of me, quadrillions of them. He paused to glance at Beta swiftly. But I had a weakness. I was nothing in myself. If I could gain power, it could only be by means of others. Success came to me through middlemen. Through a pirate, I obtained my first asteroidal base of operations. Through an industrialist, I got my first foothold on a planet. Through a variety of others, ending with the warlord of Calgan, I won Calgan itself and got the Navy. After that, it was the Foundation, and you two come into the story. The Foundation, he said softly, was the most difficult task I had met. To beat it, I would have to win over, break down, or render useless an extraordinary proportion of its ruling class. I could have done it from scratch, but a shortcut was possible, and I looked for it. My emotional control is not an easy task. I prefer not to use it where not fully necessary. So I accepted allies in my first attack upon the Foundation. As my clown, I looked for the agent or agents of the Foundation that must inevitably have been sent to Calgan to investigate my humble self. I know it was Han Pritchard I was looking for. By a stroke of fortune, I found you instead. I am a telepath, but not a complete one. And my lady, you were from the Foundation. I was led astray by that. It was not fatal, for Pritchard joined us afterward, but it was the starting point of a mistake that was fatal. Torrens stirred for the first time. He spoke in an outraged tone. Hold on now. You mean that when I outfaced that lieutenant on Calgan with only a stun pistol and rescued you, that you had emotionally controlled me into it? He was sputtering. You mean I've been tampered with all along? A thin smile played on Magnifico's face. Yes, but you were in no danger. The lieutenant had strict instructions to let us go. So the three of us and Pritchard went to the Foundation. You see how my campaign shaped itself instantly. When Pritchard was court-martialed and we were present, I was busy. The military judges of that trial later commanded their squadrons into the war. They surrendered rather easily, and my navy won the Battle of Holigar and other lesser affairs. As a result of our captivity on Terminus, I met Dr. Miz, who brought me a Visisonar entirely of his own accord, and simplified my task immensely. Only wasn't entirely of his own accord. Beta interrupted. Those concerts, I've been trying to fit them in. Now I see. Yes, said Magnifico. The Visisonar acts as a focusing device. In a way, it is a primitive device for emotional control in itself. With it, I can handle people in quantity and single people more intensively. The concerts I gave on Terminus and Haven before they fell contributed to the general defeatism. But it was Ebling Miz who was my most important find. His potentialities were high, and I needed him. Even before my war with the Foundation had opened, I had already sent delegates to negotiate with the Empire on Neotrantor. It was at that time I began my search for the second Foundation. Naturally, I didn't find it, and I knew that I must find it, and Ebling Miz was the answer. I found early that I could induce a continual use of high brain efficiency. It is a killing process for the person affected, but it is useful, and with his mind at high efficiency, Ebling Miz might possibly have duplicated the work of Hari Seldon. Partly he did. I drove him to the utter limit. The process was ruthless, but had to be completed. He was dying at the end. He would have lived long enough. Together we three could have gone onward to the second Foundation. It would have been the last battle. But for my mistake. Torrens stirred his voice to hardness. Why do you stretch it out so? What was your mistake? Why, your wife was the mistake. Your wife is an unusual person. Quite suddenly, Magnifico's voice broke. He recovered with difficulty. She liked me without my having to juggle her emotions. She was neither repelled by me nor amused by me. She liked me. Don't you understand? I stayed out of her mind. I did not tamper with it. I cherished the natural feeling too greatly. It was my mistake. The first. Torrin grimaced. How did you retain communications with your generals? There was no difficulty to it. Hyperwave transmitters are easy to handle and eminently portable. Nor could I be detected in a real sense. Anyone who did catch me in the act would leave me with a slice gapped out of his memory. It happened on occasion. On Neotrantor, my own foolish emotions betrayed me again. Beta was not under my control, but even so, might never have suspected me if I had kept my head about the Crown Prince. His intentions toward Beta annoyed me. I killed him. It was a foolish gesture. An unobtrusive flight would have served us well. And still your suspicions would not have been certainties if I had stopped Pritchard in his well-intentioned babbling, or paid less attention to Miz and more to you. He shrugged. That's the end of it? Asked Beta. That's the end. What now, then? I'll continue with my program, but I'll find another with the brain and training to equal that of Ebling Miz in these degenerate days. I doubt. I shall have to search for the second foundation by other means. In a sense, you have defeated me. And now Beta was upon her feet, triumphant. Only in a sense. We have defeated you entirely. All your victories outside the Foundation count for nothing, since the galaxy is a barbarian vacuum now. Conquering the Foundation itself was only a minor victory. It's the second Foundation you must beat, and it's the second Foundation that will defeat you. Your only chance was to locate it and strike it before it was prepared. You won't do that now. When it strikes you, you'll be just another strutting conqueror, flashing quickly and meanly across the bloody face of history. She was breathing hard. And we've defeated you, Torrin and I. I am satisfied to die. But the mule's sad brown eyes were the sad brown loving eyes of Magnifico.
I won't kill you or your husband. It is, after all, impossible for you two to hurt me further, and killing you won't bring back Epling Miz. My mistakes were my own, and I take responsibility for them. Your husband and yourself may leave. Go in peace for the sake of what I call friendship. Then, with a sudden touch of pride, and in the meanwhile, I am still the Mule, the most powerful man in the galaxy. I shall still defeat the Second Foundation. Beta shot her last arrow with a firm, calm certitude. You won't. I have faith in the wisdom of Seldon yet. You shall be the last ruler of your dynasty. Something caught Magnifico. Of my dynasty. Yes, I had thought of that often, that I might establish a dynasty, that I might have a suitable consort. Beta suddenly caught the meaning of the look in his eyes, and froze horribly. Magnifico shook his head. I sense your revulsion, but that's silly. If things were otherwise, I could make you happy very easily. But things are not otherwise. I call myself the Mule, but not because of my strength. Obviously. He left them, never looking back.
This is David Dukes. We hope you've enjoyed this double-day production of Foundation and Empire by Isaac Asimov. This program was produced by David Rapkin, abridgment by Scott Matthews. Foundation and Empire is a production of Doubleday, copyright 1991, all rights reserved.